My lands are where my dead lie buried. Crazy Horse.
Oh, hi, Mr. Lahasky here. And today we'll take the South and the West through the end of the 19th century. Much of our upcoming lectures will focus on the population centers of the North, where a second wave of the Industrial Revolution gave rise to the modern American city. The chapter will be characterized by innovation, ingenuity, and wealth, but also hardship and despair. And the developments in these urban centers came to define the United States in the eyes of the world. But as the first skyscrapers stretched towards the clouds, events of great consequence were also taking place in the West and in the South. And that's where we'll direct our attention today. But first, let's ask a big question. What was the dominant theme of the first half of American history? We've covered a lot of ground since beginning our journey through American history together. We've had war, peace, big government, small government, and sometimes hardly any government at all. We've had union, disunion, and then union again. If you had to boil it down to a single word, what would it be? Freedom? Democracy? Providence? Destiny? I'll give you a few minutes to think it over. Let's take a look now at the New South and the last West. We'll pick up where we left off, in the South at the conclusion of Reconstruction. Here's our first big idea. Despite efforts to modernize the American South after the Civil War, it remained largely agricultural, poor, and segregated. After the bargain of 1877 ended the post-war military occupation of the South, Redeemer governments were free to impose their will on the formerly enslaved. And they did. In addition to lynchings and other overt acts of violence and intimidation, black codes disenfranchised the African American population with surgical precision. In an 8-year span near the turn of the 20th century, the number of registered black voters in the state of Louisiana fell from 130,000 to just over 1,300. With the African American population on the sidelines, conservative Democratic political leaders ratcheted up their efforts to discriminate and segregate. Now, while the antebellum social arrangement of the South had dissolved with the 13th Amendment, white Southern leaders found new tools to reinforce their power over African Americans. State and local governments throughout the South passed so-called Jim Crow laws, which legalized racial segregation. These laws permitted private establishments like restaurants and hotels to refuse service to people of color, but they also applied to public spheres as well. African Americans were banned from living in white neighborhoods, attending white public schools, entering public parks, and even their access to public transportation was limited. A number of segregation laws were challenged in court, and one in particular reached the Supreme Court in 1896. 4 years earlier, Homer Plessy, a man with distant African heritage, was arrested for attempting to ride in a whites-only railway car in Louisiana. Plessy was considered to be 1/8 black, but by Louisiana law, that ancestry disqualified him from using white facilities. Plessy's attorneys argued that segregation laws violated the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed equal protection under the law. But in a decision that proved devastating to the black community, the court disagreed. The Supreme Court upheld Louisiana's segregation law and legitimized Jim Crow laws throughout the South. With the court's blessing, Southern leaders increased restrictive measures against black people in the decades that followed. In his majority opinion, Supreme Court Justice Henry Billings Brown infamously declared that separate but equal facilities did not violate the Constitution. Of course, the biggest problem with this ruling was that the separate facilities provided for people of color were never equal to those offered to whites. In fact, African Americans were provided with inferior facilities intentionally. It served as a constant reminder to them of their place in Southern society. But Jim Crow laws weren't just about public segregation. Redeemer governments also imposed limits on African Americans' interactions with white people. Throughout the South, states passed so-called anti-miscegenation laws, which forbade interracial marriages and other relations between blacks and whites. Even more cruelly, often when these laws were violated, only the African Americans were prosecuted, even when the relationship was consensual. These laws remained on the books in the South until the late 1960s. Jim Crow laws also forbade people of color from serving on juries or giving testimony against a white person in court, which further exposed the black community to acts of violence and intimidation. Historians have documented more than 4,400 lynchings, public murders of African Americans, usually by white mobs and in full public view, that endured well into the 1900s. Sometimes lynching victims had been accused of crimes against white people, but they were denied a trial, and the death sentence that was carried out on them was not the product of a judicial finding. Yet, their murderers were almost never prosecuted, and even more seldom were they convicted. Put simply, government-sanctioned racial terrorism defined the Jim Crow South. Now, economically, the South remained largely unchanged in the decades following Reconstruction. It continued to be the most agricultural, least industrial, and poorest region in the United States. Some hoped that the end of the war and the onset of the Second Industrial Revolution would allow the South to modernize as the North had done, but these hopes went mostly unrealized. Industry did take root in a handful of southern cities like Birmingham, Richmond, and Atlanta, but the South featured a largely uneducated workforce, and its failure to sufficiently invest in industrial education prevented the expansion of industry there. Most Southerners continued to work in agriculture, and most struggled to get by. Sharecropping remained prominent, and poverty characterized agricultural communities for whites and blacks alike. The establishment of Jim Crow and the continued agricultural tradition would define the American South for a full century after the Civil War. But elsewhere, things were changing. Our second big idea shifts our focus to the American West. Activities in the American West in the late 1800s were driven by railroads, ranching, and homesteading. The Great American West, the vast area between the Mississippi River and California, was the last continental frontier. Between 1865 and 1900, settlers slowly filled in the plains, thanks to the expansion of railroads and the economic opportunity that they presented. Early Western settlers were driven by mining prospects. Gold and silver strikes in Colorado and Nevada sparked rushes that mimicked the California surge of the late 1840s. But mining soon became big business that required expensive equipment, and the average American was forced out of the industry. But another frontier was developing, a cattle frontier. As railroads stretched into Kansas, economic opportunities for ranchers flourished. Massive herds of longhorn cattle were driven from the plains of Texas to the railheads in Kansas, where large towns emerged around the booming beef industry. Abilene, Dodge, and Wichita were hubs for cowboys, traders, speculators, and prostitutes. The subculture of the American Wild West was born in these cowtowns. But as fast as the booming Kansas cowtowns had appeared, they disappeared nearly as quickly. As the railroads stretched south into Texas, the need for long cattle drives was reduced. Overgrazing on the Chisholm Trail made the drives more difficult and costly, and a stretch of bad weather in the mid-1880s decimated the longhorn population. But the downfall of the American cowboy had another cause as well, the rise of the American homesteader. In 1862, Congress passed the Homestead Act. The law offered American families 160 acres of western land, free of charge, on the condition that they lived on their homestead for a minimum of 5 years and improved the land by establishing businesses, homes, or farms. For many, the offer was too good to refuse, and about 500,000 families took advantage of the Homestead Act. The disappearance of the open range through the enclosure of these homesteads permanently sealed the plains to the old-time cattle ranchers and cowboys. But homesteading presented its own set of problems and challenges. Farming on the plains proved more difficult than many had anticipated. The Kansas climate was a harsh one, with extreme temperatures and unpredictable rainfall. Globally, new technology was allowing for increased agricultural production, but the heavy machinery that was needed for efficient farming on the plains was a financial pipe dream for most homesteaders. Furthermore, the increase in global food supply drove prices down, making it even harder for homesteaders to turn a profit. To add insult to injury, railroad monopolies charged Western farmers prohibitively high rates to transport their crops to Eastern markets. By 1900, many homesteaders abandoned their life on the plains and returned to urban centers, which offered stable work and relative comfort. The United States expansion into the Great Plains had sweeping effects on another group as well. This is our third big idea. Westward expansion following the Civil War reignited conflict between white settlers and American Indians. The United States government turned to legislative and military measures to end Native American resistance to white expansion. The westward expansion of the railroads was instrumental to the economic development of the United States and the unification of the East and West coasts. But it was an unwelcome development among Native Americans, and the latest in a long history of incursions into land that had once been promised to them by the United States government. Of course, conflict between whites and natives over land predate the country itself. Settlers in the British colonies warred constantly with Native Americans until the Proclamation Line delineated the two societies in 1763. At that time, American Indians were promised a permanent home west of the Appalachians. Of course, after the American Revolutionary War, the Proclamation Line was dissolved and westward expansion resumed. In the 1830s, Andrew Jackson's government forcibly removed tribes from the American Southeast, but promised that natives could live unencumbered on lands west of the Mississippi River. This promise, too, was unkept. In the 1850s, the federal government created the reservation system to accommodate white settlers and the expansion of the railroads. The reservation system established clearly defined borders for native land, but at least permitted the retention of American Indian culture thereupon. But neither did this system endure. The hunger for railroads and homesteads and the inconvenience of Indian reservations caused yet another policy change in the late 1800s. In 1887, the Dawes Severalty Act attempted to break up reservations by offering individual native families plots of 160 acres, a homestead of their own. While this sounds like a good deal, the Dawes Act and the destruction of reservations had a sinister agenda: isolate and assimilate. By scattering tribal members on individual plots, the U.S. government made it more difficult for First Nations people to resist further incursion. The government also hoped that by isolating native families, they could force natives to assimilate to white society. The Dawes Act offered citizenship to any American Indian who remained on their homestead for 25 years and, quote, adapted to the habits of civilized life. Now, this desire to assimilate Native American culture actually had well-intentioned roots. In 1881, best-selling author Helen Hunt wrote an influential history entitled A Century of Dishonor, which chronicled the long history of U.S. government atrocities against Native Americans. While the book engendered sympathy from many white Americans, we now understand their ensuing efforts to be misguided. Rather than honoring Native American history and culture, assimilationists tried to end it. So-called reformers established assimilation schools, where Native Americans could receive education in white American customs and Christianity. Boarding schools for children were established to separate American Indian kids from their parents and their culture. The Dawes Act and the assimilation movement devastated Native American ways of life. And in the 1930s, the government formally recognized those efforts as a mistake. But not all American Indians succumbed to the will of the federal government. Between 1860 and 1900, a handful of tribal organizations resisted U.S. encroachment and fought back. The broader resistance movement may well have been inspired in 1864, when U.S. Army troops raided a village of Cheyenne people in eastern Colorado. Despite that the village raised white flags in surrender, the U.S. cavalrymen killed and mutilated over 150 Cheyenne, 2/3 of which were women and children. This Sand Creek massacre fueled a number of resistance movements in the coming decades. Military conflicts against the Sioux nations were among the longest lasting of the so-called Indian Wars of the late 1800s. The Sioux Wars began at Fort Laramie, Wyoming in 1854 and lasted the better part of 50 years. The Sioux won their biggest victory at Little Bighorn in 1876, behind the leadership of a Lakota warrior named Crazy Horse. But his would be the last major victory for any tribal group against the United States. In the coming decades, the U.S. Army dedicated increased resources to the Sioux Wars and ultimately forced the tribe's surrender after a massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890. Now, it's commonly assumed that the United States proved victors in the Indian Wars thanks to superior weaponry and military tactics. But this isn't true. Native Americans were often armed with the same rifles as their American counterparts, and they were equally skilled on horseback. To turn the tide, U.S. forces relied on overwhelming numbers and, more importantly, a strategy that threatened Native life as a whole. By launching unconventional winter campaigns, the U.S. Army could hit the tribes when they were most vulnerable. During the winter, tribes were less mobile and food resources were thinner. Warriors were faced with an impossible choice. If they left the tribe to hunt for food, their villages faced capture. If they stayed in its defense, their people faced starvation. But even more devastating than winter campaigning was a coordinated assault on the life source of the Plains Indians, the buffalo. The destruction of the buffalo probably began with the railroad companies, who recognized that the herds sustained the tribes. Railroad companies hired buffalo hunters to destroy the herds in mass. While it was never formally adopted as a U.S. military strategy, Army officials are known to have instructed their soldiers to kill buffalo indiscriminately in order to starve the enemy. In 1867, U.S. Colonel Richard Dodge remarked, "Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone." Between the railroads, the Army, and an economic depression in the 1870s that inspired thousands to take up buffalo hunting as an economic venture, the population of the species plummeted. Historians and conservationists estimate that between 30 and 60 million buffalo roamed the plains in 1865. By 1893, there were only 400 left. Winter campaigning and the destruction of the buffalo crippled Native Americans' way of life, and with it, their ability to resist the federal government. Their despair and destruction is perhaps best captured by Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce tribe, who famously decried in his surrender speech, "I will fight no more forever." Have a listen.
Surrender Speech by Chief Joseph. Delivered October 5th, 1877, Montana Territory. Tell General Howard I know his heart. What he told me before, I have it in my heart. I am tired of fighting. Our chiefs are killed. Looking Glass is dead. Tehul Shoot is dead. The old men are all dead. It is the young who say yes or no. He who led on the young men is dead. It is cold, and we have no blankets. The little children are freezing to death. My people, some of them, have run away to the hills and have no blankets, no food. No one knows where they are, perhaps freezing to death. I want to have time to look for my children and see how many of them I can find. Maybe I shall find them among the dead. Hear me, my chiefs. I am tired. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever.
Now, let's return to our big question. how can we encapsulate the first half of American history? We could say freedom, but then again, we've seen more than enough evidence that freedom was still just a dream for millions of Americans in the 18th and 19th centuries. The same is true of equality, especially in the postbellum South. Democracy? Maybe, but by the end of the 1800s, less than half of all American citizens could cast ballots. African Americans were effectively blocked from voting in most of the South, and to the chagrin of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others, women had still not been entrusted with the franchise. What if we take this exercise in another direction? Racism, hypocrisy, oppression. They seem fitting, but even these themes, accurate though they may be, discount the tireless struggles of hundreds of thousands of Americans who fought to end those evils in the first century of American history. Okay, so how about expansive? Americans were certainly that. The United States stretched from sea to shining sea by the middle of the 19th century. And by 1900, the western frontier had finally closed. Historian Frederick Jackson Turner even wondered in the late 1800s if Americans would lose a critical part of their identity when they could no longer forge westward. But how should we characterize this expansion? Was it providence or was it greed? The job of the historian is an arduous one. In the first half of our story, America has proven herself a complex study, one rife with achievements and contradictions. Maybe we can't boil it down to a single word. Maybe it's an indignity to even try. Next time, we'll shift our focus back to the North and witness a revolution in heavy industry. See you then.